After he demanded divorce 10 times, she walked away. The paper felt thin and obscene in her hand. The official stamp a small clinical star against the smudged ink of his name. A camera shutter clicked somewhere behind her, a small habit she kept when the world felt too loud. The sound steadied her. She had learned to count those clicks like heartbeats. 1, 2, proof she was still here. Years before, the bracelet lay whole around her wrist, a loop of family silver carved with a tiny compass rose. It had survived 3 generations of Suarez women and every fight they ever had. Tonight, the charm was scorched at one edge where flame had eaten the metal black, and a single tiny star of glass, blue like the sea, had melted into the seam. She turned it over in her palm, felt the jagged scar where the metal had broken, and the memory came back in bright, greedy bursts. The fire was not just a moment, it had been the grammar of the next decade. She could still trace the way smoke curled like fingers up the palace staircase, could remember the weight of Ian's hand on her shoulder as he shoved her away from the hallway where the floor hissed, could remember her own legs moving before her mind had a say, because cameras had always been in her veins, and rescue, in a different life, had been what she did with the lens. She had run into the room because she saw a sliver of movement, a shadow against the bed, and there was a man trapped and a small child wailing. She went for them both. When the newspapers wrote the story, one photograph dominated every page. Abby Moreno, smiling in a wet dress, propping a dazed Ian to her shoulder, while the reporters quoted her as the heroine who pulled the air from flames. Abby had been ready for the cameras. Abby had a publicist foldered, a well-crafted quote, a memory polished and sold. Estella's soot-blackened hair and singed sleeve were cropped out of the frame. In the official version, the woman who had shielded 2 people and banged through a locked door was reduced to a smudge on the margins. That theft of narrative became currency. People traded on it. Ian traded on it. In the months that followed, every small kindness he offered would come wrapped in the memory of that night. Every accusation in public would carry the subtext, the whisper, she is the one who doesn't belong on a pedestal. Her courage had been rewritten into a prop for Abby's spotlight. The first few times Ian filed for divorce, the papers arrived with the same fastidious cruelty. He signed them, his signature like a practiced flourish, and left the rest to legal aides and the housekeeper who also wore a halo of constant apology. The filings always came in small intervals, like a testing of a pulse. A letter slipped under the door of a hotel room while she photographed a city at dawn. An email with attachments and a terse subject line. Another envelope left on the console of her car. Each time, he watched to see how she would react. Each time he carved a notch in the years they lived together without having to raise his voice. I will not be moved by noise, he said once, in the softest possible tone, when she confronted him in the glass corridor overlooking the courtyard. He wore a suit the color of river stones and a watch that flashed too much. Do not make me make decisions. The manipulations were small and surgical. Papers waved like a threat, social moments orchestrated to humiliate, the occasional offhand humiliation in front of family that left her smiling through a mouth that tasted of iron. He learned how to wound her by arithmetic. 10 times he would ask, 10 times he would show the threat of leaving and watching her scramble to prove she was worthy of staying. Every public display was a recalibration, a demonstration that he could reduce meaning to a legal form. On the 10th time, it was not the paper that cut, but the theater of it. Ian staged a small dinner to celebrate a new jewelry line. Influencers and editors filled the gilded room with camera phones and clinked glass. He rose during dessert, and with a smile that had the accuracy of a blade, asked to make a public statement. I prefer clarity, he said, his voice sliding through the microphones like oil. There should be no uncertainty about where we stand. He made it formal. He read the words of the petition aloud, not waiting for silence, letting the click of shutters and the rustle of napkins be the soundtrack to the sentence. This marriage is no longer tenable, he announced, as if reading a product description. She sat with her hands folded in her lap. The noise felt like a tide. The bracelet burned cold in her palm. The room tilted slightly, not because of the glass, but because she felt something else fall away. The thing that had let her believe apologies could be enough. Years of apologies had become a ledger of favors owed. That night, when she stepped away from the table and left her plate half-eaten, it was not a burst of drama, just a quiet realignment. On the marble floor of the hotel lobby, she closed the door to the private elevator and opened the camera bag she always kept under the seat. She took out two things: a photograph of her mother when she was young, holding the same bracelet like it was a promise, and a small notebook where she catalogued her assignments and the things she would not forget. She slid the ring off her finger and placed it gently on top. When she left the building, there was no line of people waving her off, no dramatic plea. She walked into the city as if she had always been meant to disappear into its crowd. If anyone believed the story of the marriage, they believed the version that used paper for punctuation. They did not see the slow attrition that had been happening beneath the headlines, the micro-bullying that wore her down, the social erasures that had left her smaller each year. They did not see the way ring marks had stayed around her finger even after she removed the jewelry, a thin line of imprint where someone else's expectations had pressed. Tina was waiting at a small cafe on the edge of the old market when Estella arrived. Tina had known her since college. She had been there for bad haircuts and worse breakups, for the day Estella almost didn't get the scholarship, for the time she sold a photograph for far less than it was worth because a man with power had asked her to. Tina talked with her hands, and when she smiled it was like light ricocheting off water. "You left," Tina said simply, as if it were the only premise the world needed. "I left," Estella answered. Saying it out loud rebalanced something inside her. Saying it was like closing a book that had been opened too long. Tina hugged her like people do when words fail. They sat with cups cooling between them, watching the neighborhood settle into evening. Estella's ears buzzed sometimes now, an aftertaste of the smoke, but the world had become a study in texture rather than noise. She noticed the way the light softened on the coffee, the way a child's laughter spilled down the street from a playground. She noticed how the camera in her lap looked both heavy and full of possibility. The first weeks were awkward, shaped by ordinary logistics. An apartment with crooked blinds that let dust paint the wood slats gold at sunrise. A stack of unpaid bills that smelled faintly of paper and tired promises. The awkwardness of not having someone to split a grocery list with anymore. The quiet was enormous, but it also contained a new kind of music, her own decisions. She began to work again. Assignments came slow at first. A corporate portrait here, a wedding with a frantic mother there. But what people noticed, slowly, was the way she photographed things. She took pictures that looked like they had been breathed out from inside. A seamstress bent over a dress in a blue-lit room, an old man blowing steam from his coffee in winter, a girl's hair catching the sun like copper thread. Her images had a tenderness that radiated without asking permission. A small gallery owner saw a set of photographs she posted, a young woman on a balcony in an old neighborhood, the city unfurled below her like a map, and called. The show was modest, a single room with a white wall and a brass plaque. The plaque read, Estella Suarez, where light stays. At the opening, a few faces from past assignments drifted in. Murmurs of praise came like a sound that arranged itself into consequence. A critic in a weekly magazine wrote a paragraph that rippled in unexpected places. "An artist who knows what it means to carry heat," she wrote. "The frame becomes sanctuary." When her name began to appear again on small lists, something in the machinery around her noticed. There are people who collect stories and hoard them like talismans. There are people who cannot stand to see a narrative unchallenged. Abi, with her polished smile and a habit of stepping into frames that did not belong to her, felt the twitch of anxiety as Estella's light grew. Rumor is a jealous animal. Rumor needs a stage. People who had once laughed with Ian at quiet nights now felt the air change. He had expected a certain trajectory. His wife would endure, or she would beg, or the marriage would be tidied back into place. She had not done any of those things. She had, painfully and with no melodrama, walked away. The attacks came less like a storm and more like coordinated waves. At first, a handful of online posts questioned her story, suggesting the gallery credits were exaggerated, implying she had bought her way into the show. Then, doctored images surfaced. A photograph of Abby and Estella crossing paths at the gallery opening was doctored to make it look as if Estella had shoved Abby. A still taken from a private video was altered to suggest Estella had been intoxicated. The comments that followed were vicious in their precision. People who had never met her posted with the arrogance of those who believe rumor is truth. Estella learned, in those days, the particular cruelty of digital interrogation. that 100 voices could stand enclosed around her life and shout until the edges blurred. She hired a small legal team Tina recommended, one woman who smelled like tea and who typed in sentences with the fierce economy of someone who had spent a life defending fragile things. The woman sent out cease and desist letters and began the slow, tedious work of unmasking how images had been manipulated. Forensics, she said, could sometimes look at metadata and trace the invisible fingerprints left by editing software. It was not instant, but it existed. That word, exist, was something to hold on to. Then the floodgate opened. A video surfaced on a rumor site claiming to show a moment from the night of the fire, deliberately framed to suggest Estella had left someone behind. It was grainy and ambiguous, but in the age of snippets and outrage, ambiguity is the clearest weapon. The video was shared. The shares were reported by feeds, and then by feeds of feeds. Abi retweeted a condemning headline. Ian's brother posted a coy message about consistency, and his friends liked it. The world they had built around the original theft of the fire memory was enough scaffolding to hold up a second lie. Estella watched all of this from a small kitchen table, fingers around a mug that did not warm her. She felt the sound of the camera shutter like a pulse running parallel to her own. She could, if she wanted, go on the defensive. She could issue statements. She could plead. She could beg people to look at the facts. But she had left because pleading had never been enough before. Begging had always been what they expected from her. She would not perform humility for an audience that liked spectacle more than truth. Tina put a hand over her knuckles. "They'll have to prove it," she said. "We won't let them smear you without a fight." And then a message came, an email, sterile and corporate, offering a different kind of help. It was from Lee Torres, CEO of a company in the South City who ran foundations as well as industry. Lee's note was measured and direct, no fanfare. He had seen her photographs, he said, and he was moved. He was sponsoring a renovation of a community center her mother had begun years earlier, and he thought her work would complement the campaign. There was a number to call. There was also below a small sentence. "My team would like to meet you, Ms. Suarez, if you are willing." She read it twice. In the past, offers from men with power came with invisible contracts. She approached the idea with suspicion, then curiosity, then something that felt like cautious hope. Lee did not send flowers or public statements. His assistant forwarded an invitation to a quiet preview night of the center's plans. He wrote simply that her mother's charity mattered. The first meeting with him was not cinematic. He did not stand beneath a city spotlight and declare devotion. He stood in a blueprint-strewn room with a coffee cup in his hand and an expression that had been hardened by the responsibility of 1,000 decisions and softened by the recognition of something worth supporting. "You have a steady eye," he said when the subject turned to her photographs, and he meant it as praise without currency. "You see what others pass by." There was no pity in his tone. He listened as she talked about her mother's plans, a scholarship in memory of women who didn't get to finish school, a practical seed fund for trades, and as she explained the bracelet's history, his gaze did not flicker away. He asked questions, not about her scandal, but about the project itself. When she described the bracelet, the way it had been a talisman through generations, he nodded as if he understood the weight of small things. Afterwards, he walked her to the car and spoke a sentence that would lodge in her like a quiet map. "I don't think support is something you buy with press," he said. "It's something you commit to." Lee's presence was not a rescue so much as a boundary. He did not ask for explanations. He did not offer public declarations. He offered a partnership, funds for the center, an agreement to keep the campaign's focus on the beneficiaries rather than on his name, and a quiet promise of professionalism. He arranged security for some of the events when he learned of the threats. He sent a team, not a PR persona. Estella liked that. She liked it because it kept her agency intact. She had left because the world reduced her to notes and conditions. She wanted to be seen as someone who could accept help without anyone else writing the narrative. The gallery's second show was larger. Estella's photographs filled 2 rooms and a small starry courtyard beyond the folding glass. Someone had strung lights overhead, and the effect was like a private galaxy. Small gold sparks that turned the night from practical to kind. People wandered and read the captions. They heard the soft tap of footsteps and the low murmur of conversations. the bracelet was displayed in a glass case, not as a relic of pity, but as a symbol of endurance. A plaque explained its provenance simply, a family piece passed from mother to daughter. Someone had polished the edges where the burn mark sat, so the metal caught the light with a scar that looked like a map. When the first doctored video hit the feeds, it reached into the edges of the courtyard like a cold wind. People pulled out their phones and scrolled, and the room's warmth receded. The video was not explicit about who had manufactured it, but there were always hands eager to fill the blank. For a small moment, the world became a chorus of doubt. Ian, who had been seen in the city that night with Abby and a room full of friends, posted something later, brief and measured. Complex truths deserve careful thought. The message was a surgical stone dropped into the pond of public perception. Estella watched his words and felt a familiar tightness climb her spine. She had expected retribution. She had not expected it to be so loud. She could have fought back in the ways people expected, through interviews, through public statements. But when your life has been rewritten so often, public refutation is almost always swallowed by the machinery of spectacle. Instead, she chose small counters. She met privately with the forensic journalist Tina had recommended. She saved her receipts. She guarded witnesses who remembered the night differently. She reconstructed the morning of the fire in quiet interviews with firefighters who had been on duty, with nurses who had tended her wounds, with an old neighbor who had heard the child's cries. Each statement was a stitch. None of them alone would mend the garment, but together they made a seam. The smear campaign accelerated like a machine preloaded for a strike. Anonymous accounts amplified the doctored images. An influencer connected to Abby posted a commentary video that framed Estella as unstable. A celebrity columnist wrote a piece about how storms needed protagonists to feed on, and the piece was shared meticulously. It was in the middle of this erosion that Estella received a note from someone she had not heard from in years. Mason Suarez, her father, whose temper had once been a furnace in the family that made small fires of its own, reached out on a day that smelled like rain. He sent only a line, "Be careful." My reaction was a mix of cold obligation and old ache. He had not been kind in their past. His hands had been heavy with a kind of anger that had nothing to do with her. She thought about whether to answer, and sat on the reply button until the cursor blinked itself into sleep. Walking the city alone after that night, she found herself in front of the old jewelry shop that the Garcia family owned, the one his family had used as a display case for both wealth and stories. The windows were lit, the displays glittered with polished certainty. She pressed her forehead briefly against the cool glass. The bracelet inside looked smaller, as if it had been shrunk by the light in there. She felt, suddenly, the entirety of her life being catalogued on another person's shelf. That night, with the city hushing into late hours, and the camera sitting on her table like an obedient pet, she pulled out the notebook where she kept the things she promised herself she would never forget. She wrote one line only, "I will not perform my pain for them." The sentence was both a vow and a boundary. It was an act of self-preservation that cost nothing to the world but meant everything to her. The next morning the legal woman called with a small victory. The source of one doctored image had been traced to an account tied to a PR firm that had worked with Abby in the past. Forensics could tell that the still had been altered. It was cold comfort, but it was proof. Proof mattered. Proof was the language of law and insurance, slow, exacting, but it had teeth. They filed a suit to demand takedowns. They prepared an affidavit. What Wire did not tell her was that story is not only proven in courts, it is performed in the minds of people who have already decided what they want to see. The legal win would create a record, but the social ripple remained. She had to live in the space between facts and reputation while the case is untangled. Lee, for his part, continued to act with a quiet steadiness. He arranged for her mother's project to have a modest fund before any headlines turned into gale force. He insisted on confidentiality, on names for the beneficiaries rather than press kits. He sent photographers who were not interested in drama but in craft. Sometimes he would call and ask simply how she was sleeping. He respected the space of her silence. He never asked about Ian unless she wanted to speak. He was content to be present in practical ways. Tina, however, had less patience for practical. She introduced Estella to a woman who understood social media authenticity. Someone who could flag accounts, who knew enough to trace IPs with legal permission, and who promised to keep Estella's timeline tidy. They began to produce content that was simple and truthful. Behind-the-scenes videos of Estella printing photographs in an old darkroom she rented by the hour. Interviews with women whose lives had been changed by the charity. Stories of the bracelet and its family history told by the people who had kept it safe. Authenticity, they hoped, might cut through the noise. But internet storms rarely behave like weather. They are manufactured, and someone with means can still buy the thunder. The morning a well-known magazine published an op-ed by Abby with a photograph that showed Abby standing under the same charred stairwell where the fire had started. Estella felt the air inside the studio thin. Abby's piece was elegant, a litany of soft sufferings that repositioned her as vulnerable and wronged by rumors. Abby wrote with the practiced ease of someone who knew how to script sympathy. The piece had the effect of a javelin, designed to tilt hearts back toward the safe, familiar narrative, one which left Estella hanging like a half-answered question. Estella did not respond publicly to it. She chose something that many might think cryptic. She began a series of photographs called When Light Returns, portraits of people rebuilding. The first image in the series was of a woman whose hands were raw from mending nets. The second was a boy kneeling in a churchyard reading, his face tipped into a sunbeam. The series was quiet but relentless. It did not argue, it persisted. A week later, the invitation arrived. Elegant paper, gold emboss. It was for a banquet hosted by the Garcia family to celebrate Ian's latest venture. The invitation promised a night of spectacle, a new jewelry collection reveal, a room of influential people, cameras, and a stage. The card's script looped like a courtesy smile. On the back of the invite, scrawled in a hurried, unfamiliar hand, someone had added a line. "We thought you'd be back." Estella read it twice and felt the old small animal inside her inch toward a wary posture. She could have burned the card and walked away. She could have ignored the sliver of provocation. Instead, she made a choice. She would go, not to be humiliated on a stage, not to beg, not to be used. She would go with a camera slung across her shoulder and a decision crafted like armor. If they wanted to perform truth, she would bring witnesses. If they wanted spectacle, she would photograph it. Tina protested at first. "It's a trap," she said, and the word had the sound of someone protective and tired. "He will do something. He always does." "Then we'll make sure he can't," Estella said. Her voice had a calmness that was new, something like a blade honed by purpose. The camera strap pressed into her shoulder, as if to remind her of the last time she had used it for rescue. This time, she thought, she would use it for testimony. That evening, she stood in the wings of the grand hall, a pocket of shadow. Around her, chandeliers caught the light and refracted it into thousands of small suns. Heels clicked. Wine was poured. Conversations flowed like silk. Ian flowed through the room like a current he had practiced for a decade. He was magnetic in the way practiced men are, smiles calibrated, gestures timed for applause. Abby stayed at his side, a starched picture of composure, cameras trained on the couple as if a scene were coming into focus. He had, of course, announced an unexpected twist, a public statement that would clarify things, he said in tongues of gilded restraint. He intended to step forward and call for a final resolution, to place a divorce petition on the table of public opinion, and to make an example. When he rose, the room inhaled with the weight of a public not used to being denied theater. He spoke about legacy and clarity, and the ethics of truth in jewelry as if he were reciting lines from a speech book. Then, as if reciting the part he had learned by heart, he produced a folded legal form and let the cameras see it. There was a sound like cold rain when all 10 of the people in her immediate circle looked at her. Their faces registered a dozen things: surprise, pity, hunger. Estella felt none of those things. For a heartbeat, the camera she held felt impossibly like an instrument of defense. She lifted it and photographed him as he held the paper aloft. He looked at her then, a small, astonished thing flickering in the practiced smile. "Come home," he mouthed, with all the theatrical gentleness of a man who believed he could mend the world with a request. She lowered the camera. The shutter clicked once and the image registered into her memory. A man in a Riverstone suit, the light catching a watch, a paper like an accusation. The blue star of the bracelet seemed to glow in her mind. She stood and walked out. Walking out in that moment was not a drama. It was a mechanical movement, an action she had rehearsed in her head 1,000 times. Things that are done too often become precise. She unmovedly left behind the armful of expectations like a coat she had not asked to wear. Outside, the city night swallowed the building's glow. The air was cool. A stray car honked in the distance. Estella walked to the corner where a street vendor sold empanadas and bought one without thinking about it. She ate with her hands in the dim light, feeling the press of pastry and spice and realness. She did not look back at the building until she had crossed the block. When she did, she saw Ian standing at one of the windows, his silhouette rigid as if behind glass. He held the paper to his chest. Abby had her hand on his arm. The scene looked, for a breath, like a tableau. Estella touched the bracelet that hung now on a fine chain around her neck. The burn mark pressed against her skin, and she felt a small constellation of resolve. He could file papers in public. He could perform guilt and contrition. He could stage spectacles of legal threats. But he could not file away the truth. She had no idea, in that late hour, how public humiliation and private power would collide in the days to come. She only knew that she had chosen a path built of steps she owned. The first step was simple and terrifying. Call Tina and tell her exactly where she would sleep that night. The next was to photograph the empty chair at her own table and to send that image to the woman who had been her legal counsel. The final immediate step was stranger. She called Lee's number. She kept the call brief and professional. She did not ask him to rescue her. She accepted only what he offered, logistical support for the community center, and an offer to present the truth through the small, precise channels they both trusted. When she hung up, the room felt both larger and narrower. The city's distant sirens were like veins running with blue light. Somewhere, someone was already composing the next tweet. A smear would not wait for silence. But a human life, she remembered, was not the same as a trending moment. It had shape and texture. It had pauses and small acts like the one she took now. She opened her camera, printed a photograph, and placed it on the kitchen table. It was a portrait of a girl in sunlight, hair catching like copper thread. The image was honest and steady. She propped it beside the bracelet, and she let the wind through the open window carry away the rest of the night. Outside, under the city's indifferent stars, a different set of lights was beginning to prepare themselves for a new kind of spectacle, one that would test lines of loyalty and the meaning of truth. Inside, Estella cupped the bracelet and felt the burn's edge cool to something that resembled belonging. She had left. That much was true. What came next would be a tangle of cameras, courts, and careful witnesses. She could not yet know who would stand by her in the spotlight or who would try to sell her silence. But for the first time in a long time, she felt the particular light of possibility, a horizon that was, at least for now, all hers to photograph. If this story is holding you, subscribe for more. The days after the banquet unraveled like a film reel torn in two. Fragments of moments, the soft hiss of camera shutters, and the steady work of people who refused to let spectacle defeat truth. Outside the luminous glass of the Garcia Hall, the city moved on. Inside, consequences began to gather weight. Estella resumed the small, exacting routines that kept her world whole. She photographed, she printed, she filed. She met with the forensic journalist, Mara Rios, who moved with the sharp confidence of someone used to taking apart narratives and rebuilding them into evidence. Mara brought a tech analyst, Camila Ortega, a woman whose hands knew the secret language of pixels. Deepfakes leave spores, Camilla said on their first review of the files. Simple, almost clinical words. Color shifts, temporal inconsistencies, metadata that doesn't match the camera model. It's sloppy work in some places and precise in others. It's not instantaneous to prove, but it's provable. They began to pull threads. A doctored still showed editing layers inconsistent with the claimed source. A viral clip carried the ghost of compression artifacts that betrayed its manufacturer. Camilla traced IP addresses and found a pattern of logins clustered around an agency that had handled media for Abby Moreno during the year after the fire. Her subpoenas, filed by Estella's legal counsel, brought bank records and invoices into a narrow, ugly alley of accountability. Meanwhile, Estella continued compiling human testimony. Firefighters who had been on duty the night of the blaze gave recorded statements. A nurse who'd helped dress her burns remembered the order of events with a clarity that only trauma and duty can produce. She confirmed details that matched Estella's memory in ways that would not be easily mistaken. An old neighbor's recollection of footsteps and a small child's cries, simple things, until they were added to the ledger of witnesses, provided context the doctored footage could not erase. Public vindication would be slow, but private vindication, built of those recorded voices, of the files Camilla could parse into incontrovertible artifacts, began to feel possible. Lee's contribution came in pragmatic increments that were almost, for Estella, luxuries of decency. He arranged for secure storage of originals, for discreet transfers of evidence to Mara's team, for private meetings in rooms without photographers. His assistants liaised with lawyers and security. He did not make speeches. He made space. "People will watch what they want to believe," Lee said once, hands wrapped around a mug as if to ground himself. "We work until they have no plausible lie left." There were costs. The Garcia family did not cede absence gently. Ian's social circle tightened at first, protective as if in a defensive ring. Online trolls found faces to follow. A handful of hired commentators, the kind who sell scandal like seasoning, kept the chatter alive. And then, as Camilla and Mara gathered more, the chatter began to shift. A small PR operation connected to Abby started to fracture when a mid-level employee, panicked and leaking, turned to a lawyer rather than to the company's management. He sent a folder of invoices and messages to a reporter he knew years earlier. The reporter, who had once admired Abby's polish, felt a new obligation. He passed the material to Mara. The first public unraveling came in a modest headline 2 weeks later. Payments, edits, and a pattern, new documents raise questions. The piece did not shout. It laid out dates and transfers, emails with subject lines like photo retouch schedule, and an attachment showing an edited image in stages. In the comments below the article, people argued as they always do. But in boardrooms and in the offices of talent managers, messages were forwarded with small notes. Look. Abby's reaction was theatrical in the way that theatrics can be rehearsed until they become a protective mask. She posted an eloquent column about truth and resilience. She granted an interview about how she had also been wounded by rumors. Words can be elastic enough to cover many sins. Her words found sympathy in certain corners. Yet the documents kept arriving, an unspooling chain that connected the forged visuals to a handful of operatives and a budget line. When the operative who had physically staged one of the early post-fire heroin photographs was arrested for his role in a separate incident, an assault at a gallery where he had been hired as pushback, the police found on his phone messages that corroborated the invoices, logistical notes, payment mentions, a casual shorthand for narrative control. Under questioning, he agreed to provide a statement. He named names. That moment, when a person behind the curtain spoke, was smaller and stranger than a movie would pretend. It arrived late on a gray Tuesday. A short recorded testimony turned into a legal document, a phone transfer screenshot from months earlier, a receipt with an address that matched an email server used to distribute a doctored clip. Nothing exploded in a single cinematic boom. Truth, in this life, grew like a building brick by brick. Ian's world contracted as the evidence accumulated. He moved through the sequence of reactions men of his breeding have been taught by the quiet tutors of power: denial, defensive posturing, then the fragile theater of regret. He made a public statement that slid between culpability and vagueness, an apology that managed to sound both like an admission and like a deflection. It did not satisfy anyone who had watched the files and heard the statements. His father, who had long believed in the family's capacity to contain scandal through strategic alliances, found his options narrowing. There were private encounters. Ian sought Estella once, through an intermediate, and left a message, a line of voicemail asking for a conversation. Estella did not call him back. She had no interest in rehearsing the old choreography of apologies and countersigns. She had stepped out of that treadmill. If he wanted to speak, he could go to court or to the people he had harmed and speak there. Words to her needed witnesses. In the meantime, Mara built a structure for a revelation that was not a trap, but an exercise in accountability. She planned a public release carefully, a verified dossier that summarized the data, included sworn statements, exhibits, and a clear narrative of who had done what. She approached it like a photographer mounting a show. Light the facts cleanly and let their edges be visible. The Garcia family scheduled a celebration a month after the banquet, a gala planned as an engagement and brand reveal. It was more elaborate than the banquet. They intended to write the next chapter in full gilded sentences. Invitations went out to the same glittering list. The press would attend in force. Ian, who had come to see public image as something he could calibrate, intended to use the night to reconsolidate reputation. Estella received her invitation with a quiet sense of the inevitable. The card felt like a formal challenge, a public stage where she might be expected to play the same role she had always been allowed to play. She and Mara discussed logistics. Mara proposed a public release the night of the gala. Camila arranged for a version of the dossier to be accessible on a secured server, and for a selection of evidence to be projected onto the hall's media walls at a set time. Lee's team coordinated with Mara's to assure the physical security of witnesses who would attend. They planned nothing theatrical in tone. They planned everything in accuracy. Tina, who had become Estella's last sounding board and occasional conspirator, packed a small bag the night of the gala and a spare memory card. "Not for revenge," Tina said, tightening the strap of her purse. "For record." At the gala, the hall bloomed like an artificial night. Chandelier light folded into the breasts of gowns. The new jewelry pieces glittered in their velvet cages. Cameras perched like small birds at the edges of every table. Ian moved through the room with the practiced ease of a man who understood performance. Abby flitted beside him, an image of composure. Estella arrived with Lee as her escort. He walked a few paces behind her and stayed deliberately unobtrusive until the evening's business ended. They stopped only long enough to greet a few acquaintances. Lee's manner was consistent, attentive, respectful, never searching for spectacle. When the moment came for Ian to speak, when he took the stage to clarify and to lay another port of narrative, there was a hush the way oceans draw in when wind shifts. He spoke about vision and legacy, his voice untroubled, and then he produced what he intended to be the night's dominant image, a ring, a prepared flourish, a reading of a paper that would finalize things in a public way. Estella sat in the audience with a camera on her lap. Her hands did not tremble the way they once had. They recorded, they preserved. When Ian held the paper up, flashes stuttered through the hall. He looked across the room. For a half second, their eyes met. What he saw was not a woman on her knees. It was a person whose stance declared refusal. That sight, for a man used to unavailability disguised as compliance, was a mirror he had not expected. At the agreed moment, Mara took the stage beside the event's scheduled after-party show. She was not the event's invited speaker, but she had negotiated a brief slot. 3 minutes, a table, a display. Her voice hardly rose above the room's murmur as she said, "We have materials to present, verified documents, testimony, and evidence of coordinated disinformation." It was as modest a pronouncement as possible. The projection screens glowed, images appeared, pages of invoices, redacted email exchanges, and a timeline. Camilla's work took shape in annotated frames. A still image marked with pixel artifacts, an IP log traced to a marketing company used repeatedly in Abby's campaigns, a bank transfer that matched dates noted in the operative's testimony. There were sworn statements from the night of the fire, brief, precise accounts from a firefighter and a nurse, and the operative's own admission of participation in staged publicity. The room shifted, conversations hesitated, then began to thread themselves into new patterns. Some faces went pale, some phones slid into pockets. Abby stood with something like the composure of a child on the brink of crying, and then without warning she lifted a hand and slammed a glass down. Sound prickled the air. "That's not proof," she hissed, voice raw with a new vein of fear. "Those are fragments. You can't pin intention with inference." Mara's delivery was merciless only in the sense of being exact. "Intent can be demonstrated," she said. "We have payments and communications. We have a witness willing to swear under oath to coordination. We have image analysis consistent with fabrication." She read a quote from the operative's statement. The sentence dropped into the room like a stone that made ripples in concentric circles. Ian left the stage. He tried in the following minutes to contain the narrative through damage control, a video posted on his account in which he said he regretted the collateral consequences of his family's business, in which he lamented misunderstanding. His voice trembled once, an edginess that wasn't contrition so much as panic. The legal wheels began to turn publicly after that night. The PR firm named in Camilla's reports announced an internal review. The firm's chief executive released a statement saying they took allegations seriously and were cooperating with authorities. The phrase was a standard, cautious architecture. Civil suits were filed for defamation and for damages. An investigation into the staging and harassment led, in the months that followed, to subpoenas and then to arrests, when evidence suggested illegal coordination with hired provocateurs who had planned and executed attacks. Abby's career buckled beneath the weight of the documentation. She lost endorsement deals and a recurring television commitment. She issued an apology that read like a crafted law statement, regret without full confession. In the quieter corners of industry, managers and producers who once sought her light began to distance themselves. It was not elegant punishment, it was consequence. Ian's fall was more complex. He was not a villain crafted by pure malice. His cruelty had been a system of small violences that accrued into an architecture of control. As legal pressure mounted and family boards convened, he found his options limited. He was forced to step down from positions that required a public face. He tried at times to rebuild relationships through gestures, an unexpected donation to a fund, a private voicemail full of words that wanted to be forgiveness. He pressed himself to public contrition in stages. The public could see only fragments, a public statement, a few interviews where his voice sounded thin. Privately, he sought Estella again, this time in person, leaving a note at the door of the small apartment where she now spent most nights printing images. The handwriting was old and oddly anxious. The message asked for a meeting. Estella did not go. She had no taste for walk-through apologies without meaning. If someone wanted to prove remorse, she had long since decided they'd do the work in ways visible to those they'd harmed. Remorse would be measured in restitution and in the relinquishment of control, not in staged apologies with cameras. If Ian wanted to be part of a reparation, that work would have to be public, bound to accountability, not to the private conjuring of words. Lee, by contrast, never believed that love was performance. He believed in keeping promises. He kept the center's funding discreet until the legal process would not implicate the beneficiaries. He supported Estella's exhibits, arranged for the community center to open with the women it had been meant to serve as the centerpiece of the opening, and refused cameras that would make him the story. When the opening came, the center's courtyard was a small constellation. String lights hung overhead. People who had been beneficiaries of earlier seed grants spoke into a microphone without fanfare. They told simple stories. How a craft class saved a job, how a scholarship had funded a trade certificate. Estella stood to the back with her camera, not as an outsider but as a witness. She photographed moments that were not for marketing but for memory. Lai watched her from the periphery and clapped as if it were a natural thing to do. The months that followed were a delicate choreography of courtroom calendars and community work. Some accused were charged with harassment and conspiracy, some settled civilly. The law is often patient where public appetite is immediate, and so the cases moved with their own rhythm. Estella testifying in a deposition felt less like exposition and more like reclaiming a voice the court would translate into an official ledger. She spoke with a calmness that was not brittle. She spoke as someone who had measured her words as carefully as she measured light. Ian, facing legal scrutiny and a new degree of isolation from his inner circle, experienced a remorse that was at times sincere and at times performative. He admitted to having allowed a culture to exist around him that dehumanized others. He admitted to failing to challenge the machinery that rewrote a night's heroism. But there are edges of harm that an apology cannot flatten. Estella found, as the months accumulated, that her anger was not a thing to extinguish overnight. It became instead a ledger of choices. What to do with the man who had once been her husband? There were offers of private reconciliation from Ian, a letter, an attempt at dialogue, but Estella's replies were measured. She did not deny him the possibility of change. She simply did not make her life an instrument for his transformation. If he wanted to be better, that work would be done where she could see its effects, in how he treated other people, in how he addressed public harms, in whether he resigned power that had enabled the deceptions. Forgiveness, she thought, could never mean erasure. Meanwhile, a quieter transformation happened between her and Lee. It was not the sudden leap that movies insist upon. It progressed in practicalities and in the small mercy of consistent kindness. Lee met Tina and Mara with a demeanor that was straightforward. He wanted clarity, not ceremony. He talked to Estella about logistics for the center, about budgets, about the names of the young women the program hoped to support. When he offered to fund a restoration for the bracelet, he did so as a gesture of honor rather than a photo op. The bracelet was repaired in a small workshop in a part of the city that smelled of solder and lemon oil. The jeweler, a woman named Rosa, worked on it with a careful, reverent hand. She soldered, smoothed, and set the tiny blue star in a way that left the scar visible but stable, like a healed seam. When Estella held the bracelet after Rosa finished, the metal felt different under her fingers. Restored, but not altered beyond recognition. "Keep the scar," Rosa said, nodding as if she were reading a private map. "It tells the truth of what it has been through." Estella did keep it. She wore the bracelet more often now, sometimes on a chain near her heart when she felt like keeping it close, sometimes on a table beside a printed image as a talisman of where she had come from. It became, in small ways, a symbol not of victimhood but of endurance. The public arc wound toward a private denouement. The Garcia family retreated into restructuring and PR damage control that could not, in the end, reverse the trajectory of certain truths. Abby attempted to rebuild her career in quiet venues, offering apologies and eventually speaking with a journalist about the corrosive ways of fame. Her confession, partial, guarded, did not erase what had happened, but did add a new chord to the public song. Culpability sometimes arrives as slow contrition rather than dramatic confession. Ian, meanwhile, faced the administrative consequences of board votes and public scrutiny. He resigned from a leadership role and retreated from the levels of social life he had once used as stagecraft. He checked into therapy publicly, an act that some applauded and others discounted as merely performative. He published a long statement about power and privilege, one that acknowledged systemic failings. Estella read it once and then set it aside. His attempts at private reconciliation continued in letters that circled between admission and begging. She neither encouraged nor dismissed them outright. She recognized that people can change, but she also recognized the right to choose which changes to receive. The ending took its shape in the simplest of ways: a promise kept, a decision asserted, and a life oriented forward. The day Lee proposed, quiet, without cameras, in the low light of the community center's garden, was not a performance. He had waited until the nights of string lights when children had learned new trades and when the women the fund supported had their work on a small stall. He bent on one knee without fanfare and opened a small velvet box. Inside, instead of a new jewel, was the restored compass bracelet, the blue star set like a tiny guide. "I don't want to replace your stories," Lee said. "I want to keep them safe, with you. I don't want to control your light. I want to be a companion to it." Estella looked at him for a long time. She thought of embers and ashes, of the legal filings, of the nights when she had believed that everyone would prefer the bright, easy lie to the slow, inconvenient truth. She thought of the way Lee had never insisted on being the headline. She thought of the small whisper of her own voice in witness statements that had felt like an instrument of dignity. She said yes. Not because she needed rescue, but because she wanted a partner who had demonstrated boundaries, respect, and a willingness to step aside from power when it harmed others. It was an affirmation of mutuality, not submission. They married in the garden, simple, a gathering of friends and the women the center served. The ceremony was held under the starry canopy that had become their motif. Strings of lights hung overhead, turning the night into a small private galaxy. The bracelet, now on a fine chain around Estella's neck, caught the light periodically like a small, steady star. Tina cried through her vow to produce bread for the couple. Mara and Camilla stood nearby like a small constellation of witnesses to the truth's arc. Mason did not attend. He sent a letter that, in its awkward way, recognized harm and asked for a different kind of reconciliation. Ian did not ask to attend. His absence was, to some, an unsatisfying note. To Estella, it was simply a boundary kept. At the reception, Estella walked through the tables and looked at faces, some that had been cruel, some that had been kind, and some that had been complicit, but now looked awkward under the lights. She felt an odd freedom in that scanning, a sense that life, finally, was a mosaic of people chosen and not chosen. She mounted a small step and gave no speech. She offered thanks, and the words that mattered were small. Gratitude to those who had listened, to those who had made the center possible, to the women who had shared their stories. Lee did not claim her past as proof of his devotion. He simply stood with her, attentive and steady. When the night ended, guests left in small clusters, headlights turning the street into ribbons of white as the city went on. Estella hung her bracelet in her palm, then returned it to the chain at her throat. She felt the scar next to her skin, a memory that had stayed with her like a star in the corner of the sky. In the weeks after the wedding, the legal proceedings continued on the slow rails of justice. There were settlements and public apologies, and a few prosecutions for the hired provocateurs who had crossed into criminal harassment. The PR firm that had produced doctored images faced fines and reconfigurations. Abby faded from headline superstardom into a smaller orbit. She attempted to reinvent herself through the work of reparation and volunteer work. How successful that effort would be was something time would measure. Estella's name returned to exhibition walls and to grant announcements. Critics wrote of her as a photographer who had, through misfortune, learned an even steadier compassion for human cycles. She took commissions that were meaningful. Portraits of women starting small businesses, a series about caretakers, a project on community resilience. Her work was never the kind to court sensationalism. It simply looked and let what it observed speak. Once, months later, she found herself in a quiet moment at the center's garden, the same string lights a soft shimmer above. She held the bracelet between thumb and forefinger and thought about the man who had once signed papers like a practiced flourish. She did not wish him harm. She wished him accountability. She wished for herself a life that was hers and not a page kept by others. When Ian reached out again, it was not with pleading, but with a letter that suggested genuine introspection. He had resigned several posts and committed to a public course on ethical leadership, he wrote, small steps perhaps. The letter asked only for a conversation about how to make reparations to those he had wronged. Estella read it with a clear-eyed neutrality, and then, after a long breath, she replied with a note of her own. That any attempt at restitution should be public and tied to the concrete support of causes that helped people he had harmed. She did not write the word forgive. She wrote instead about care and boundaries. When she and Lee sat on the garden bench that night, watching a child chase a stray light across the grass, she realized the future had the simple, astonishing quality of being hers to choose. She did not look at the door behind her as she leaned into him. She looked forward to the stars above and to the small constellations of work and love she would choose to keep. There were no cinematic explosions at the end, no miraculous absolution for the guilty, no neat erasure of pain, but there was consequence, and there was repair, and there was a life rebuilt. Estella had walked away after 101 petitions, but walking away had not meant disappearance. It had meant the quiet, hard construction of a life that honored her agency. On a wall in her studio hung a print from the When Light Returns series, a woman mending a torn sail, stitching with slow hands under noon glare. Estella often stood before that image and thought about the smallness of stitches and about their ultimate power. Lee did not insist that she forget. He insisted only that they do better together. That, she decided, was more than most had ever asked of her. Share this if it moved you, and watch the playlist for more stories of resilience and reclaiming truth.